I actually read this paper for my ethics class on love and epistemology, or the role of love in epistemology and this feminist take on epistemology. And it spoke about how the other, in the case of this paper, females are often suppressed and are often othered, right, to have certain ways of looking at the world or dealing with reality, and are dismissed. But she actually argues that the other actually, or in this case, females actually have a sort of advantage, an epistemological advantage, to be able to know more of what's about to happen that often the Western rational thinking of black and white thinking doesn't often see. And we often see this in, a lot of dystopian narratives where things like groupthink and, everyone thinking in the exact same way in this black and white sort of results in this extreme dystopia. But if we could bring about this sort of the other into the picture, so in this case, feminist epistemology of feminism into the picture, because they see things that the majority or the status quo don't see, then we can bring about a shift in the way our knowledge systems work, our social systems work, our economic systems work, our political systems work, if we are willing to bring about this shift from this Western or positivist black and white thinking that adheres to or sees knowledge as power to dominate and suppress, to this more feminist view of having a more holistic picture and bringing in somewhere emotions into the picture, right? Western thinking often says, oh, emotions are disruptions. We don't need to think about emotions. Emotions are not good for thinking. But that paper actually argues that no, emotions play a huge role in how we think, how we decide, what we do. And so rather than dismissing them, we need to have a more holistic view of our decision making and consider emotions and feelings in our day-to-day lives and within all the systems that we're having. So I believe that the other, in that's the other sort of perspective to the other, and how the other can actually bring about a sort of transformation and change within society.
Let me throw another. I was trying to figure out how I was going to enter this into the conversation because I wanted to suggest it to you. And this seems like a nice segue. You were saying kind of the other to the other. And now I'm going to confuse it even more by saying to the other, which is, there's a book I read a couple months ago called The Power, which I don't know if you've heard of. It's by a woman named, I think her first name is Naomi. Her last name is Alderman. And the concept is, all of a sudden, young girls and young women start to have this power of electrical current, that they can shock someone, that they can kill someone through the power of their energy. And so in some ways it's a feminist dystopia. Like it's kind of looking at the world where the women are now in charge, right? Because they've got the power. But what it gets at, and what I found most fascinating about her treatment was, and I'm sure you've heard this before, right? This notion that if women were the leaders of the developed countries, there'd never be any war, right? Because women, as you said, they're different. But what Alderman is positing is, are they different because of their gender? Or are they different because they didn't have power? If they have power, does the power corrupt? Absolutely. And this whole kind of maternal femininity thing, that's not nearly as important. What's important is when you're on a date and someone, wants to have sex and someone doesn't, whoever is stronger, whoever has more power gets their way. And so what this book explores is, okay, when girls are on dates and the guy starts doing something she doesn't want, psst, like knock it off. They've got the power. So how does that affect relationships? How does that affect power structures? How does that in this novel, how does that affect the way that women behave? Because I would argue by the end of the novel, there's very little maternal kind of caring, empathetic, stereotypical female behavior going on. It is much more, I got the power, and so I'm going to do what I want. Which is I found really interesting to think about outside the realm of gender and our stereotypes of gender.
Yeah, that's actually very fascinating, Professor. Thank you for sharing that, because as you know, that you gave us an assignment for this class, what is your personal dystopia? And I was just throwing about random ideas of dystopias that could be, right? So in the class, we read this novel, The Handmaid's Tale, where it had this feminist view on society and how the female narrative to a dystopia, feminist dystopia, where males are completely dominating and whatnot. And I was wondering, what if it was the opposite? What if it was females in power and extreme power? If we, the pendulum, if you were to put it in the spectrum, is on one side of males right now, and males being in power. And obviously that's creating disruptions. That is one sort of dystopia. But what if it went complete opposite to the extreme flip side where females are in power? And I actually posed this question to a couple of feminist friends of mine, and they did not believe it. They're like, oh no, that's not possible. Females being in power would never result in all this dystopian destruction. There would be a utopia. And I had a hard time believing it, because I feel like, logically speaking, or maybe I'm thinking too rationally, but if the balance is disrupted either one side or the other, it doesn't matter what gender it is, right? Beyond the gender, if you were to think of it in a meta way of yin and yang, if we're too much towards the yang, that also brings about some sort of dystopia. And if we're too much towards the yin, that would also bring some sort of dystopia. And it's interesting you put that around it, because that's not an opinion or narrative that we've seen, at least so far in real life in society. It's been predominantly a male-dominated culture that we've been living in. So I'm curious to know a little bit more about this novel, and how what did the other look like, or the other to the other, where females were in extreme power? What did that sort of dystopia look like?
So I don't want to give away too much of it, because especially with what you were thinking about with the project, I think you should read it, because I think you would find it. Let me take a step back. I don't think it's great literature. I don't think it's written as well as Handmaid's Tale. I don't think Alderman is Atwood, but she does do kind of what we talked about for the project. She kind of thinks about some of the repercussions. And so instead of kind of giving you a broader explanation, let me share with you one of the details that I think is emblematic, and I think you will also find very interesting. One of the points that's made is, as men become more suppressed, right, there become men's support groups, right, and defensive men groups, and they become very belligerent and they're armed. And one point which kind of plays out in the novel, kind of doesn't, is, okay, if men are in power, if men are in charge, from a purely reproductive angle, you can't eliminate that many women. Like, each woman, right, produces one child every 9 months. That, you can't, you've got to have women in order to kind of continue the population.
Mm-hmm.
If women are in control, that man can father thousands of children. You need much fewer men. So you can kind of do away with 75% of the male population, and human population still going to be fine, which I was like, oh, that's interesting, right? If it becomes a world where women can kind of enforce their own power by being a hyper majority of the population and literally only using men for breeding purposes, you don't need as many handmaids as you did in Gilead, right? You might need 10 for a state, right? And just kind of keep harvesting their sperm, and you just keep impregnating different women, and society's fine, which I had never thought about in that way, but I was like, ooh, that's dark and that's dastardly, and it's true. So that was just kind of one of the examples she used that I was like, oh, that's nice.